Popular belief, and if we're honest, many history textbooks, has most people at large thinking Africans were savages until colonized, and many South Africans believing that strange white men showed up and went on a warpath, throwing our indigenous people onto boats and ruining their way of life. But the truth is far more nuanced. Both understandings are in one way or another incomplete. For starters, one should entertain these two thoughts. How did the Dutch so easily bring their boats to shore if there was no ports for their ships? And if there was no port before the Dutch got here, who built it? Food for thought. The truth is the forming of the Cape Colony is not something the Dutch sneezed into existence in 1652. That wasn't even their first time in the Cape. No, the forming of the Cape Colony is something that the indigenes had going for themselves already. The thriving metropolis we now call Cape Town started off as a port city settlement called Khoikhoi. Let's start with the indigenous side of things, since their story, going back 2,000 years, is often ignored. There is evidence of South African society doing trade with Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China from at least 800 CE. By the time that the Khoena reached the Western Cape in the early 2nd millennium, there were already trading lines from the south to ports in Mozambique. In fact, accounts show that Europeans consistently spent plenty of time at Table Bay, from as early as 1601, time they spent intermingling considerably with the indigenes. Joris Spilbergen, commander of the Dutch fleet who gave Table Bay its name on a visit in 1601, mentions 6 sailors being conveyed to land where a hospital was established. I don't know about you, but not many savages have hospitals running for foreigners fresh off the boat, and their stay could be anything from 3 weeks to more than 9 months. This completely redefines the narrative that Van Riebeeck tamed the indigenous people. He was a much more problematic person than is recognized, but don't worry, he'll get his turn. This isn't about him yet. The European presence at Khoikhoi was semi-permanent. Maritime records show that from 1590 until 1700, there were 2,632 ships that visited the Cape. 1,071 of those ships were stationed in Table Bay between 1600 and 1652. While the Dutch had the highest number of ships doing stayovers, England, France, Portugal, and Denmark all enjoyed lengthy stays in Table Bay, proving that Cape Town has been a hot commodity to tourists for about 422 years. Eat your heart out, Paris. Keep in mind that history would have us believe that the indigenes just watched all this happen since 1488, when the Europeans first showed up, or 1421, when the Chinese fleet of Zheng He passed by during its circumnavigation of the world. So that begs the question, what was so much of Europe doing by the coast? Well, it comes down to the powerful dynamics of the region which held strategic importance to the Cape. The Dutch were fighting the English, French, Portuguese, indigenes, and Muslim sultanates at different times, and they needed to fortify their factories and bases in the east from adversaries such as India to even Japan. By looking at the number of vessels that returned from all that conflict across so much ocean, we see many of the ships never made it back home due to ships being worn out, condemned, or wrecked. Only around 50% returned to Europe. This called for the improvement of shipbuilding technology and practices, and the need for repair stations and refreshment posts en route. It also became the chief incentive to replace the indigene proto-port operations with the more sophisticated operation. In other words, the Europeans wanted to gentrify Khoikhoi. But it wouldn't be easy or cheap, and it would surely ruin the budding relationship of trade and commerce between Europe and the western coast. Around this time, the different indigenous tribes of the Cape were going through several different levels of varying conflict due to the fragmentation and separation of the different tribes. The advent of tribes among the Khoena from way back when to the 17th century follow a pattern of multiplication by division, segmentation and differentiation, a product of internal differences and external impacts. The Khoena migrants from the north of South Africa along the Limpopo Prior had been in the Eastern Cape from around 650 CE and in the Western Cape from sometime just after 1050 CE. From the 16th century, it seemed there were just the Khoikhoi moving between the west coast and the peninsula, depending on weather patterns and grazing availability for cattle. The effect of periodic European presence changed the way of life and the economy of the indigenes so that a permanent presence emerged at the Cape Peninsula. The emergence of deviating tribes, individual entrepreneurs, and farmers concurred with the English making use of the services of two men, Khore in 1613, and Ashumau, also known as Hada, in 1631. Rivalries and conflict were rising amongst the different tribes people, and records show that the different groups were not against gaining the upper hand in their conflicts by asking Europeans to back them up. The nosiest were the English, for their interventions made them direct promoters of change in methods of living and economy for the indigents by taking key personalities, like Khore and Ashumau, abroad to London and Java. This was then copied by the Dutch. At least 5 verifiable Khoena were taken abroad to gain experience and training between 1613 and 1655, which led to new commodities such as skillets, knives, iron, copper, brass, tobacco, clothes, beads, and alcohol becoming available and skewing the existing economic values, including the trade of ownership of livestock, presenting new social problems and opportunities. Khore and a companion were kidnapped and taken to London in 1613, but only Khore survived the trip. Sir Thomas Smith of the English East India Company had hoped that after training, Khore would enable colonization plans for Table Bay using Newgate convicts, but this experiment was abandoned after 3 years. The English opted for a Plan B, and Khore, no longer being the fulcrum of their schemes for the Cape, became the first of the formal traders used as facilitators by European shipping. He used this position to become a wealthy authority figure and chief with a strong following. Unfortunately, it is said that he was murdered by the Dutch for non-cooperation in 1626. Thereafter, there was an immediate drop in economic relations at the Cape. Even though Khore had served other European nationalities, the English suffered the most from his death, as they had enjoyed the best relations with him and his people. The English, needing a new Khore to be their liaison, then recruited and sent Ashumau to Southeast Asia for training at Java. On his return, the English took the unexpected step of settling him and his community on Robben Island to run a formal supply and postal station. Ashumau did this skillfully. He had even successfully directed the French away from an English station once. Ashumau was also a postmaster, trader, and portmaster, was a proficient linguist, astute, and knew the value of pitting the English against their enemies, the Dutch and the French. But Ashumau wasn't a puppet, as the English would have preferred. The Khoena knew to keep their main herds of thousands of cattle, sheep, and their families far inland away from the Europeans. Ashumau filled a defensive buffer role for his people. Regardless of the basic nature of the services he provided, he did offer post and communications, stevedoring, which is loading and unloading cargo, ship's chandlers, and trader services. Around 1638, Ashumau had outgrown the Robben Island station and returned to the mainland and established a settlement alongside the Khoikhoi River mouth, known in the local language as Sweetwater or Amisa. Here the indigents established the foundation village and port operation that would become the city of Cape Town. The Khoikhoi Khoena were even called watermen by the Dutch in recognition of their role as guardians of the fresh water because they assisted the seamen to load water for the ships. Unfortunately for the indigents, Ashumau and his people, it was all downhill from there.